Welcome, everyone. I am Alan Amirkanian. I'm the director of the American University of Armenia's Acopian Center for the Environment. We are very pleased to have had a project, a four-year project with the University of Hohenheim, and Dr. Claudia Bieling, who is on this call, has been a great partner over the past 4 years on a project we briefly call in an acronym as GATES, and the project is about participatory planning and participatory planning using GIS tools for environmental ecosystem services governance and also biodiversity conservation. So it has been a very active 4 years. We've done many things through this project, including 5 thesis projects on forestry, on wild harvest, on energy security in rural areas, on land use land cover mapping, and as well as having had several training programs led by Dr. Bieling and her colleagues on ecosystem services and public participation GIS tools, how to use them effectively, how to integrate them into curriculum. And we've also developed e-learning modules. Let me just quickly show you, share my screen on e-learning modules that capture a lot of the lessons learned. And sorry if I'm oversharing, but e-learning modules on overview on participatory approaches, a module on deep dive into public participation approaches, a few tools that are commonly used, how we engage in public participation in managing wild plant harvest, public participation, urban biodiversity and green zone planning and management. And now, since because of COVID, we have lots of savings, travel savings, so we're using that to develop more modules, educational modules. And those would be around forestry, public participation and forest management, as well as public participation and water resources management. And finally, a module on ecosystem services approach and also use of or role of public participation in ecosystem services governance. We have, in addition to these, so let me stop sharing. So in addition to these, we have, developed a video on wild harvest, which is almost complete, and we'll release that and we'll let you know that. Wild harvest practices in Armenia in rural communities. We've case studied 5 examples across the country, from wild harvest for, high quality, high-end market, export market, business to communities and families using wild harvest for their nutritional and food security, to educational efforts around using wild harvest to engage kids in understanding nature and gaining greater appreciation of nature, and a few other cases. So that also will be available for educational purposes, as well as engaging public in discussion on the role of wildlife, and especially wild plants and their harvest in both the cultural and also economic aspects in rural communities. So this virtual conference is part of this project, and also as a concluding product, we'll have an online platform which will contain all of the outputs of the project and will be available to the public. This conference specifically we organized with the idea of bringing all the different pieces together and allowing a discussion, from policy to research approach to tools available to communities and policymakers on how to think about integrated landscapes, how to think about, in a more integrated way, incorporating social, ecological aspects in decision making, and also looking at the state of the art in terms of tools available. Today, we will focus on the policy questions of integrated landscape management. Tomorrow, we'll have 2 sessions, which will focus on the socio-ecological approach to research and how research can become impactful. And the third session, which also will happen tomorrow, will be focusing on 3D public participation tools, and how those can be used to effectively engage the public in decisions on planning, both planning decisions as well as management decisions related to ecosystem services and integrated landscape management also. So with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce the first speaker to this today's session, and then we'll be joined by panelists who will discuss the issues raised by our speaker. Our speaker, Dr. Sarah Scher, is an agricultural resource economist who specializes in integrated landscape management, particularly agricultural landscape analysis and planning. In 2002, she founded the nonprofit Eco-Agriculture Partners, and since has advocated for food security, sustainable livelihoods, and ecosystem services throughout the world. In 2011, she co-founded the global network Landscapes for People, Food, and Nature. And in 2019, she launched 1,000 Landscapes for 1 billion people, focusing on landscape regeneration. Dr. Scher also serves on the boards of Biodiversity International USA and Solutions for the Land. She holds a PhD in International Economics and Development from Cornell University. Dr. Scher, it is a distinct pleasure to welcome you to this session, and we look forward to your talk. Thank you.
It's wonderful. It's an honor and a privilege to be here with you all today. My talk is going to have 5 parts. First of all, I'm going to review some of the dramatic changes that are underway in policy perspectives around agriculture and natural resource management in the rest of the world. While I have worked in the United States, Africa, Latin America, and Asia, I have no expertise in the Caucasus, but I hope that learning about experiences elsewhere will stimulate ideas that you may want to adapt or consider in your own goals of sustainable development. So the second element I'll look at is some of the shifts in thinking that are required in order to address these new challenges. Thirdly, to introduce the potential tool of integrated landscape management. Fourth, to talk about some of the specific policy actions that are needed in order to realize the opportunities of integrated landscape management. And finally, I'll very briefly introduce you to our new initiative, the 1,000 Landscapes for 1 billion people. So from what I do know, a little I know about Armenia and the Caucasus, I do think that some of our policy approach also needs to change away from this siloed nature. It can't be anymore about managing the agricultural resources only for food and agricultural production. There are many other stakeholders, not least of which is urban development, that are needed to be there. If you go to the next slide, in fact, policy is no longer about managing environmental, quote, externalities, because these are no longer external. They're actually part of the system. Agriculture is a central feature of ecosystem management. The map that you see here is actually 20 years old, but it shows the areas where more than 60% of the land is under agricultural production, or 40% or 30%. And certainly you can see that the regions of Eastern Europe are among these. What this means is that managing effective watersheds means managing agriculture for watershed services. It means that managing for wild biodiversity means managing agriculture to protect wild biodiversity. And similarly, managing for carbon, for climate mitigation, means managing the carbon stocks that are in the soils and vegetation in agricultural areas. So this is really a very different way of looking at the world. If you'll go to the next slide, policy is also no longer about just being sustainable. Agricultural production is facing really serious environmental threats that cannot be addressed by improving crop varieties, or tweaking existing agricultural production practices. We need to deal with serious issues of desertification, acidification, soil degradation, aquifer depletion, watershed degradation, making irrigation resources more scarce. Rainfall and temperature are changing due to climate change, which in turn is affecting agricultural pests and diseases. Flooding is affecting farmers, storm intensity, and urban and industrial contamination from nearby cities and factories. So if you'll go to the next slide, indeed, land use and agriculture are now, if you'll go to the next slide, is a dominant driver of climate change, climate destruction, as well as being a victim of climate change. Right now, more than 25% of all the greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture, and that share is increasing as the energy sector and transport are actually becoming more climate friendly. If you'll go to the next slide, the last thing that policy is no longer about is trade-offs. Not to say that there are not trade-offs between agriculture and environment, but we cannot choose one or the other, or we will get neither. Production systems and landscapes need to produce both food and ecosystem services, and I think this is the real challenge. If you go to the next slide, what we realize now is that fragmented and siloed policy approaches won't work to address this kind of integrated situation. If you go to the next slide, just to take one example, while monocultures have been successful at increasing levels of agricultural production and productivity, they only provide a solution to food. They don't address the water, climate, biodiversity, employment challenges that we need in our rural landscapes. So if you'll go to the next slide, I'll then say, if this is the situation, what does this mean about the way we should think about policy? And I think the Sustainable Development Goals actually provide a framework that was intended anyway to be explicitly integrated among the 19 goals. But to do this requires 4 specific changes in our policy thinking. If you'll go to the next slide. First of all, the idea that we leave no one behind, which is the mantra of the SDGs, means meeting all of the goals in every landscape and territory. That doesn't mean in every single farm, but certainly in every single region or landscape. So what's the challenge for doing that? So how do we think about that? The second policy challenge, if you'll go to the next slide, is achieving sustainable agricultural intensification and agricultural income growth without simplifying the landscape. It means we need to look at solutions that increase crop genetic diversity and species diversity, as well as wild species diversity in the landscape, not necessarily on every farm, but in the landscape, habitat diversity and landscape diversity, so that the landscape will provide all of the Sustainable Development Goals. If you go to the next slide, the third change in thinking that we need to all have is that we not having think about food security here, biodiversity here, agricultural exports there, but rather that economic activities in the processing sector and in the industrialization sector need to not only not pollute and not degrade, but they need to also be regenerative of our landscape resources. If you'll go to the next slide, then the fourth change in thinking that this is calling for around the world is that policies need to reflect a systematic process of consultation and negotiation with all the stakeholders that have an interest in these different development goals. It's something that can't actually be managed top down, even by the strongest governments, in part because every landscape is different, and therefore the needs are different and the possibilities are different. The groups in agriculture, biodiversity, water, need to design solutions together, not just do the thing, not just have a debate about whose priorities get to win, but rather about how can everyone do things a little bit differently so that it will have benefits to the other goals of the local economy, the local society, and the local ecosystems. So if this is the challenge that we need to have, one of the exciting opportunities that's coming has come in the last couple of decades in different parts of the world. If you'll go to the next slide, is integrated landscape management. Not the only solution, but it's one of the most powerful. This is a mechanism through which long-term collaboration, we're talking about generational collaboration, not projects, among land managers and stakeholders to realize the multiple objectives from the landscape. How do we regenerate not only the resource base, but the economy and our social fabric in our rural areas? There's 5 features to integrated landscape management. This is how you know it when you see it. First of all, the stakeholders have agreed to the long-term vision they're trying to pursue. Secondly, there's some kind of a platform for those different stakeholders to share knowledge and to negotiate. Third, there's an explicit attention to how different parts of the landscape are interconnected, whether it's through the flow of water or the movement of pests or the movement of markets, but that's really made explicit in the planning. It also means that all land managers are managing and using practices that benefit multiple objectives in the landscape. So forest managers care about biodiversity in the forest, they care about watershed management, they care about the production of wood products, etc. And finally, that the development of new markets and the development of policies reflect that vision and reflect those interconnections. Now, if you'll go to the next slide, slide, how is integrated landscape management happen? It seems complicated, but done well, it actually makes life easier for people. This is what we're starting to find. So the 5 elements of action are starting at the center with the development of a landscape platform or partnership. And this may be organized by government, local governments, it may be organized by civil society, it may be organized by a watershed authority or someone who has the capacity to convene different actors. We even have some cases where businesses have helped to develop these landscape partnerships. And this is about developing relationships of trust where hard decision-making, hard negotiations can be done effectively. A second major element is to achieve a shared understanding of the different stakeholders about the landscape. It's very interesting to take a drive or a walk through a landscape with people who have different perspectives on it, because they often, they have their own way of looking at the landscape and what's important and what's a problem and what's an opportunity. And by actually having structured discussion among the stakeholders to get to a place where they understand what the state of the landscape is, the perspectives of others, the opportunities and the barriers for sustainability is a really central piece. It's not about technocratic decision-making. It's about the stakeholders understanding why things need to change. The third element is getting to a shared vision and agreed strategy for action, and developing a short-term action plan that reflects that strategy that all the stakeholders see themselves as part of and have contributed to. The fourth is sustaining collaborative action and financing the investments for the businesses and projects that are needed to develop the whole investment portfolio in the landscape. And finally, there needs to be a learning process to see what's going well, what's not going well, what have been the impacts, and what does that mean for the change in the action plan. If you'll go to the next slide, the outcome of this process is a coherent strategy and collaborative action for landscape development, where together, by different actions going on in different parts of the landscape, you generate a overall healthy ecosystem, a healthy, inclusive, green economy, and human well-being across the landscape of different social groups. This is the goal that we're looking for from integrated landscape management. If you go to the next slide, what we've seen over the last couple of decades is enormous innovation as local people struggle with these issues, struggle with conflict with other land uses besides their own, and are all coming up with these approaches. And Eco-Agriculture Partners has actually documented, I think we're up to 105 different communities of practice that have emerged with different names like integrated watershed management, territorial development, agricultural development corridors, eco-agriculture landscapes. There's a whole range of them. They're all struggling to find ways for agricultural production to fit well and fruitfully with other sustainable development goals. If you want to go to the next slide, 6 years ago, Eco-Agriculture Partners, along with partners in the Landscapes for People, Food, and Nature initiative, including Claudia Bieling, who's here today, participated in a series of studies of finding these large-scale landscape partnerships around the world. And we've done this now in 4 continents. This was 6 years ago, and we came up then with about 420 of these large-scale landscape initiatives. Since then, the numbers have grown dramatically as many of the international agencies have discovered and gotten excited about the integrated landscape management approach. So there's many more coming from being funded by the World Bank, being promoted by the UN Convention on Biodiversity, on climate change and land degradation, by the Global Environment Facility. There's also at least a dozen countries around the world that have embraced this as an approach to sustainable development, and many national and international NGOs. We've even found in the last couple of years that businesses have taken a leadership role in helping to form and organize some of these partnerships, because they see it as the only way they can sustain their license to operate in these landscapes. If we go to the next slide, just to show you some of the illustrations here from these original 420 landscape cases, you can see some key points about them. First of all, that the number of objectives for the landscape partnership ranged from 6 to 8 different concrete objectives. Also, between 6 and 11 different stakeholder groups participating, and a number of them with business partners. So they really are involving many different actors. Governments, local governments are in almost all of them. National government agencies that operate locally are also very commonly part of these, and sometimes leading them, but sometimes contributing to them. If you'll go to the next slide, these actually had already gotten impacts. This shows some of the sustainable development goals and what proportion of the landscape partnerships, this doesn't include the Europe data, actually have achieved some of their major objectives around increasing yields and profitability in agriculture through these processes, reducing environmental impacts, protecting biodiversity, improving water quality, etc. Increasing food security. So many of these were not very old. Some of these landscape partnerships were relatively recent and still had demonstrable impacts on these actors, multiple goals at the same time. So if we go to the next slide, if this is the opportunity we have to achieve our range of our goals in a coherent way through integrated landscape management approaches, what does this mean for policymakers, especially at the national level? we would argue, based on evidence from other parts of the world, that they can achieve a range of critical objectives through a more streamlined approach, rather than having 17 different programs for the Sustainable Development Goals, rather by working with these integrated landscape initiatives that are addressing the goals for their place-based development, that this in fact is could be a very efficient way for national governments to achieve their objectives as well. And we have identified 5 policy actions that, at least in other places, can help to realize these opportunities. So if you'll go to the next slide, the first one is to set supportive government policies. In many places, the activities happening at this landscape or territorial level don't really have much of a role in the development of policy. So some actions that are being taken are, for example, to formally recognize landscape collaborative plans and partnerships and involve them in policy process, get advice from them, see them as partners in the implementation of your goals. And sometimes that really needs a formal recognition in law. Secondly, to regularize land and resource rights. I know in Armenia, at least, there's a land reform that's going on here. And one of the things is to consider the need and provision for ecosystem services together with production agriculture, and also to look at the rights and responsibilities of how land management impacts others, groups in the landscape, and make sure that the rights to ecosystem services are also represented in these kinds of systems. A third aspect, there's many, but a third aspect of supportive government policy is to ensure mechanisms for coordination among the government's sectoral agencies, so that there's a single map that all of the government agencies are using to do their planning, that there's processes for consultation and engagement in planning, in implementation, and in monitoring. We still need specialized agencies, and we still need the expertise of the different groups. But rather than focusing that expertise only on a single objective, it's how can they contribute to making also the work in other ministries also be aligned across the way with a goal of sustainable development. So if you'll go to the next slide, the second kind of policy action is to find ways to provide tools and training for implementing integrated landscape management. It does require new kinds of processes that people are not necessarily familiar with. It's new ways of looking at sector problems. It's skills of convening and facilitation that are needed, planning, group planning, et cetera. And it's important that networks and training institutions within the country can build capacity in all 5 of the elements of ILM, meaning the landscape partnership development, landscape assessment, planning and strategy and planning, implementation and finance, and assessment methodologies. These are a few of the tools that are available from eco-agriculture partners. But as I'll describe later, we're part of this 1,000 Landscape Initiative, where we've already identified almost 400 tools that are out there for helping people. We're sorting through which ones are the most useful for people on the ground. The third, if you'll go to the next slide, the third policy priority is around developing the investments in a landscape. And the big shift here is, instead of just finding a good investment or 5 good investments on their own that are helpful for sustainability, we're looking at how we can have a whole portfolio of investments in a landscape. Some private sector, some public sector, some civil society projects, some joint projects, that if you look at them together, they will transform these landscapes towards sustainability. There's 2 basic kinds of investments that we refer to. One of them is asset investments. These are the investments that actually make change on the landscape. Changes in crop and livestock production, value chain companies, industry and mining, green infrastructure, natural resource restoration, greening the built and urban infrastructure, et cetera. Those are the things that impact the landscape directly. And then the second kind is the enabling investments. These are the other social and organizational issues that are needed so that you can deliver asset investments that transform the landscape. These are things like multi-stakeholder platforms, strategic planning, spatial assessments, building capacity, having research and innovation systems. So this is when we look at a landscape, we can think about what are the set of investments and activities that are needed within those, public, private, and civic, to make something happen. And the government can play a really important role in facilitating this process and making sure that expert support is provided for this landscape planning. If we go to the next slide, just to clarify a little bit about when we talk about, quote, landscape-friendly investments, it means that each individual investment needs to contribute to landscape sustainability, and that means economy, nature, and people. It considers the spatial interactions and its offsite impacts. It aligns with public land use rules and with other investments to realize ecosystem benefits. It aligns, if there is a landscape action plan, it aligns with that. And the project actually does monitor its landscape impacts. If we go to the next slide, the fourth policy priority is to help mobilize financing for those investments that I was just describing. There are many, many sources of financing that are appropriate for different kinds of projects. There's increasing international funding for some aspects, especially related to climate and food systems. But it's really important not to be driven by the priorities of external international organizations, but to have your investments that you think are priority, and then to actively seek financing changes. New kinds of financial mechanisms are needed that can capture funds from large private sector and government sources and disperse them to the many small projects and businesses that are in the landscapes. We need better risk mitigation practices and other features, aggregators in the landscape that will bring together small projects. So there's an important role for national policymakers in helping to mobilize and integrate the finance that's required to deliver that landscape investment portfolio. So if you go to the next slide, the last big aspect of policy action that I wanted to mention here is the support of research. On the one hand, research for agricultural production systems that have these positive co-benefits for climate, for biodiversity, for food security, for climate change adaptation, as well as for carbon sequestration. And you can see some of the specific ideas there that people are researching around the world at the level of breeding, crop breeding, and at the level of agronomic practices, and the level of agro-processing. And these are the research needs to continue over time, because climate change is going to, as well as economic change, is going to continue to create new challenges. So we need a continuous process of innovation supported by research. If we go to the next slide, in addition to the agricultural research, we need much more research on integrated landscape management itself. And this is, how do we coordinate the agricultural research with the natural resource research? How can we have a deeper understanding of the agricultural and resource ecology in these mosaics? How can we understand the process and support the process of systems level innovation at the field, farm, community, and landscape scales? We need to find ways to make it cheaper to do regeneration and to know how to manage, to monitor the impacts. So again, this aspect of research support and also research support for the negotiation that's taking place in landscapes around how to achieve these multiple goals is really needed. And it's a somewhat different kind of research than what we had done historically. Let me go to the next point here, the next slide. For this last brief part of my talk, I do want to introduce you to a new initiative that's called 1,000 Landscapes for 1 Billion People. This is an initiative that started in late 2019, and we call it a radical collaboration between a large number of actors. It's being championed by 7 organizations. One of them is my own, Eco-Agriculture Partners, which is the convener of the initiative, but very strong. It's being co-led by Rainforest Alliance, Common Land, which is a Dutch landscape development organization, the Landscape Finance Lab, which specializes in finance, as the name says, the international NGO Conservation International, focused on the biodiversity elements, at Sun Valley nonprofit technology group, Tech Matters, and at the UN level, the United Nations Development Program. But in addition to those, we have several dozen other technical partners for the initiative, and the work has started also to collaborate with partners in 15 landscapes in 15 countries around the world. And those numbers are increasing right now. The aim of 1,000 Landscapes is exactly in its name. By 2030, which is the date closing, for the Sustainable Development Goals, that the tools and services and networks that are being provided by 1,000 Landscapes will be providing support to 1,000 landscapes where 1 billion people are living. So it's a very ambitious program, but it's being implemented through a very horizontal process of networked actors. And it would be fantastic to build this network up also in Armenia and in the Caucasus. This could be really very, very exciting. To just give you a flavor of the kinds of things we're working on, the kinds of services and tools we're developing. If you'll go to the next slide, I want to say something about these five interconnected services. Oops, sorry, you don't have it. Let me, no, go back to the other one. Then stay there. Yes, that would be fine. So my own presentation had one more slide that I had added, but this is just fine. So the first service is the first application of information technology to the challenge of landscape management. Surprisingly, this really just has not been done. And so we're trying to figure out a very practical management platform for the leaders of landscape initiatives to be able to track what they're doing, to access data, to store the information they're doing, to facilitate communication between different stakeholders in the landscape. We want to reduce the time and cost that's needed to plan, develop, and fund investable landscape projects. The second is the Global Action Network, sharing knowledge and building connections. This will be powered by Terrasso, the digital platform, but the network will enhance knowledge sharing among landscape partnership leaders online and through in-person dialogue, build alliances to inform policy, and link partnerships more effectively with businesses, governments, funders, researchers, and expert technical services. The third area is the landscape capacity building to mainstream landscape thinking and skills. And these are user-centered tools and curriculum that will build the capabilities of landscape actors to develop and then deliver through existing learning networks and training institutions, as well as online. And the fourth main set of tools is the landscape finance solutions, where we're trying to shift financial flows from funding unsustainable investments to ones that will fund not just sustainable investments, but the whole portfolio of interconnected investments in landscapes that will deliver landscape regeneration and green inclusive economies. And this is working with different financial institutions, government, philanthropic, civic, and private, to shift these financial flows. And to help landscape partnerships learn how to better access different sources of financing. And then the final piece is the hub, which is really our effort to make sure that these efforts are all harmonized and to manage the global network of partners. So that's basically, if you'll go to the next slide, that's the end of my formal presentation. I'm really grateful for this opportunity and look forward to talking with you now with any questions and comments that you might have.
Thank you very much, Sarah. This was a very exciting presentation, lots of pieces to kind of dive deeply into, and I think for me even there were some very provocative, proposals put on the table about how to approach, one of the biggest challenges we have as humanity. So given that I am moderating this session, I'm going to use my advantage to ask the first question and then open it up to others. We have a Q&A session right now, about 20 minutes. So please post your questions and we'll make sure to address them. So first question is, this is integrated landscape management as you've presented it. The process requires some it is grassroots, and yet it needs some institutional capacity for long-term kind of continuity and to stick to it and get it done over generations, as you suggested. So what have you seen possible there? Because we have in our reality, institutional longevity is very short, and people forget and move on to different things, different approaches, and donor-driven most of it, and so it's very hard to keep focus on in the long term on initiatives and approaches, and especially with a lot of societies that don't have deep democratic kind of institutions built. This kind of grassroots approach may be very difficult to accomplish. So any experiences you have on this front would be great.
Sure. No, it's really an excellent and central question. And there's very big differences in different parts of the world in terms of how this has been promoted. A lot of the early generation of these landscape platforms and partnerships were very separate from governments, and governments were not supportive of them at all because they were so sectorally driven, and basically decisions were being made top down. That has changed a great deal as governments have more recognized the potential complementarity of the work by these landscape groups. And it does require, I think that it's one of the reasons why you at least in the surveys that we did, probably about I think maybe 20% of these landscape partnerships were actually convened by government government organizations, maybe 25% of them. The others were convened by universities or by trusted civil society organizations because they needed to be neutral and they needed to be long-term. So because democratic governments also, they change all the time, the people change. The roles are needed over the long term, but having a program that's also strongly grounded in civil society. Again, people who live in the landscape long term need to run it, not external donors. And the real advantage of forming and keeping these landscape partnerships and having them develop their own vision is that then when outside groups or donors or whatever come in, they can ask them to please support the plan that they have developed, rather than doing one more planning process for one more donor or whatever it may be. So we are finding now much more interest on the part of national governments to provide small levels of financial support to some of the landscape partnerships, to at least allow them to undertake important processes of landscape assessment and planning. We're finding also that local champions in the landscape, people who love the place they live, are also providing some financial support to try to do these issues. It is very important that there be a small group of leaders of the landscape partnership. It's a distributed leadership model. You need leaders from agriculture, you need leaders from environment. It's very important that that there is some resources that can fund them to work at least, a significant amount of time on moving these things forward, or they won't do it. So there's many different forms, from cooperative setups to very democratic setups. Some of them are very informal, some are very formal, but I think we're moving toward a process where we're seeing the need for longer term institutions that are supported widely, not just by one source of funding, but anyway, I'll stop there. I think there's a lot of models. They need to reflect the realities and the priorities and the culture of wherever it is they're working.
Thank you very much. Please put your questions in the chat room and we'll get to them. Claudia, I know you've been listening patiently, so, and I know you've been a contributor to this. Anything you want to add before, as we're waiting for questions to come?
Well, yes, maybe. I hope you can hear me.
Yes,
I'm connecting with a different computer. Okay, so great. Sarah, thanks so much for all your thoughts. I think very, very intriguing and very, very interesting. So you highlighted a lot the role of this bottom-up approach. And I just wonder, since people need to kind of grow into such kind of bottom-up activities, what can we do to encourage these local level activities? Because sometimes it's also a matter of mindset, of being experienced more with these kind of top-down approaches, which have been so common over decades. So how can we get people out of that and empower them and encourage them to get active and develop also this kind of visionary thinking and this trust also that they can make a difference?
Sure. No, I think it's one of the central learnings, I think, that we have had from around the world. And not when I say we, not just ourselves at Eco-Agriculture, but other groups around the way, is that you can't start to do collaborative planning until you have collaborative understanding. And so many of these initiatives spent the first few years not trying to do something, but trying to understand one another. And for most cases, there needs to be some motivation to do it. There needs to be some challenge, some threat, some opportunity, some history of conflict that makes people realize that in order to achieve their own goals, other actors in the landscape also need to do things differently to support what they are doing. So I think the first phase of this is a dialogue phase. And so you need to have a very neutral, trusted facilitator to establish some opportunities for people to share what their experience is in their landscape, what their issues are in the landscape, have others ask them questions. Why are environmentalists so upset with the farmers for doing monoculture? Most farmers don't know why they're upset. They don't understand how biodiversity works. And I know that happened with me personally. I'm an agriculturalist by background, an agricultural economist. And it wasn't for many, many years that I understood why people didn't like monoculture. And I didn't understand the process of species utilization of the land and resources. And once I did, it started my thinking about a different way that things could be done. And I think that's the same way with environmentalists who, they say, wait a minute, we want to help farmers produce more. How can we do our protected area management in a way that will support farmers? So I think being willing to invest a couple of years into those dialogue processes to a deepen understanding, to do analysis, share with people the analysis of what's going on. Most people don't know what's going to happen with climate change. And if they did, they would be a lot more motivated to participate in events like this. So sharing knowledge about what the predictions are of the kind of changes that they can expect, and are they ready for those changes, and having some dialogue and discussion. I think you can't skip that stage. You have to build trust. You have to bring people together. You have to get a shared understanding of the landscape before you can start to go to the next step. and even to necessarily formalize the landscape partnership. They also evolve over time. But that part is really, really critical. And it's really important for government actors to share what they know about what's going on in that landscape, but also to be there to listen for what people are saying are their opportunities and their barriers to taking different kinds of action. So that's a whole facilitation process, and you need to have some people who are quite skilled at doing that. But there's a lot of places to get training and support to do those, to play those kind of roles.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Okay. Hovik Sayadian, you're with us, right? If you are, you can turn it on.
Yes.
Yes, Hovik. You have been in landscape planning and management from forests to now the Savan Basin to any questions comes up when you hear this. I know you're a panelist and we'll have more discussions on this, but kind of questions about the approach itself.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Sarah, for a very nice and comprehensive presentation. Actually, I intended to write down the question, but now I can actually say, and I'm really interested in such a question, how far historical cultural setup of local population could impact on bottom-up planning, because that is something actually that has some historical cultural background for us Armenians. That is what actually I experienced in different parts of Armenia.
I don't think that there's many places in the world that had bottom-up planning. That's just not, that has not been our experience for the last 150 years. In countries that have a long history of democracy, you did have planning processes, but even where you did have local bottom-up planning processes, they were almost always sectoral. So I would say that this is a new challenge globally. There's some places it is actually easier to landscape planning in countries where there is a more decentralized, policy processes, but many that have less decentralized ones are doing a very good job of trying to support landscape level activities. So I think it's part of, it's obviously part of a question of citizenry, citizenship, but I think it's not a philosophical position to adopt this integrated landscape management approach. It's very pragmatic. It's about the fact that if you want to set goals for biodiversity conservation, you will not reach your goals if the farming community does not collaborate with you. You won't. And similarly, farmers in the context of climate change will not be able to sustain their yields unless there are improved water management systems. They simply won't. They are actually at risk if they don't do collaborative planning. So so I think you don't need to come to this with any philosophical or cultural aspects. You can, I think people tend to love the places they live. They have an emotional attachment, and we encourage people who are promoting these landscape partnerships to emphasize that shared values and shared culture, because it keeps people emotionally engaged even while they're having very difficult conversations with other people in the landscape. That you all want to have this, you love your land, right? You love your place. You want it to be there for your grandchildren. You want to see them thrive. So I think there's a piece of it that's around that. But this is really, I used to give all my talks for a decade, and I would say, if you don't have to do landscape management, don't do it. It takes time and effort and work. If there's no reason to do it, don't just do it for its own sake. You do it because you cannot solve your problems unless you get collaborative action. And the weakness of top-down planning is that land mosaics are very different from place to place. And so the relationship between forest and farming and water is very different in one region than it is in another region. So it's really very difficult at the level of the national government to make plans that are not adapted to that social, economic, and ecological reality. So again, from the point of the governments, they don't need a philosophical change. It's really a pragmatic one of how are we going to deliver our policy goals?
Mhm.
And that's going to be different from place to place, which means you need to work with local people who will inform that process, commit to the goals that you have, and adapt them to a way that's beneficial for them in the local place. So anyway, long-winded answer, but sorry.
Thank you very much. Ala Berberian from GIZ. They've been doing a lot of pasture management and energy-related, rural energy-related, lots of different work on landscape-related issues. Ala, are you with us? Yeah.
Yes, I'm here. I don't know. Can you hear me well?
I can.
Yes. Thank you very much, Sarah, for this great presentation. It was really interesting. I just want to bring one example from GIZ work from Restoration of Riparian Zones project, where we are doing restoration of riparian zones in terms of planting willow cuttings and in riparian zones and doing cleaning activities of the rivers and riverbeds and riparian zones of the rivers flowing into Lake Savan. And here we have this conflicting land use interests because often the riparian zones being under the management of community often belong to they have different land owners and land users. There are grazers, farmers who grow crops near very close to the rivers. And so these land use practices often conflict with each other. And then come the environmental practices and the mandates by different government bodies. So here we have practically felt this need of the integrated landscape management, and it would be now it would be built up to a very good bottom-up example if these local communities themselves could bring up this topic of who does this land belong to and how to use it in a good way so that it's managed in a sustainable way, but also the people, the communities benefit from it and don't lose. So they can still collect fodder because they can do fishing, they can do, I don't know, they are grazing. So all this, they can still follow their interest. So I just wanted to bring this example. Thank you.
Ala, that's a really excellent example. And I want to point out that particular dynamic is found everywhere in the world. Everyone is struggling with that even specific dynamic. And even if you look in my own country, one of the things in Florida, which is one of our southern states where grazing and water management are been much in conflict, there was a place where they were doing this landscape where they realized that there were 7 different government regulatory regimes governing them, and they were designed completely in separate processes. And one of the things they did on the government side was to sit down, and it took them a couple of years to align so that there was a single regulatory guideline for people that showed the different dimensions of importance, but also where the local actors sat down, and it took them a couple of years actually to forge out a strategy that everyone would be able to keep the most important values that they needed, say for collecting fodder or whatever, but they were doing it in a slightly different way. And sometimes this doesn't involve land ownership changes. It may just be a negotiated agreement of an exchange of privileges and rights and say, yes, this is my land, but I'm going to do this with it. I'm going to do riparian restoration with it, with the understanding that others are going to do other complementary things. So I think that's a really excellent example of why, again, very difficult to solve a problem like that at the national level. It really requires, if you think people are going to follow what you want them to, what you think they should do, they have to be bought into it, which means they have to have had some role in the design of the solution. So it's a great example. Thank you, Ella.
Thank you. Yes, and there's similar examples abound in our case, in Armenia's case. For instance, afforestation projects that are using pasture lands, and then that it directly comes into conflict. The central government decides this is where we're going to afforest, and that's actually pasture land for the community, and they immediately have a conflict set up. Arek Garapetyan, I don't know if you feel you have a question about the approach. I know, I don't know if you're still with us, but I know you're working on forest landscape management planning. So, and you're doing a project with the World Bank right now. So any questions that come up from what Sarah presented?
Thank you, Alan. It was really nice to listen, Sarah. It was a very actual topic we are discussing today. And of course, a lot of questions are arising during this topic regarding to integrated nature resource management. And as we have mentioned, currently our company Soliton is doing research for the World Bank, and it's directly interlinked with the restoration opportunities assessment in Armenia. And we have an issue of developing very different models of restoration, not only forest planting, but also various different options that potentially will support restoration, but are not directly planting or even not direct forest management. And we would like also to have the advice from Sarah, what specific actions, options she can suggest based on her experience that will be useful for community, that will be helpful for the forests, but at the same time supporting forest restoration. So combining this community development component, combining the benefits for community, at the same time support to nature regeneration, maybe for forest landscapes.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that's really positive about the work that I do is that I get to talk to people from all over the world who are being so creative in their solutions. And there are really, you know, people sit there and they're in conflict and they're like, I can't do this unless they do that, and they limit their set of solutions, and that's why it seems insuperable for them. And I think as soon as you release that, it sounds like you are doing this is exactly the kind of research that's needed, where you're looking at a range of options so that local people can consider them, not to accept them necessarily, but it opens their mind to ways in which they could modify the way that they are doing the work in their places. There actually are a lot of resources around from the FAO, from UNDP, and at the international level for the specific question that you're asking around. I mean, there's so many different models that are being used right now for that approach. I probably can't go into them all right now, but I'd be happy to follow up. But this is actually, the questions like this are one of the reasons why we are prioritizing this global action network for 1,000 landscapes, because what I'd really like to do is connect you up with 10 people doing this in different parts of the world, so you could specifically start a conversation with them about the approaches that they're using. But yeah, I think what we're finding is there are a very wide range. Some of them involve tree planting, some are protection, some are agroforestry systems. So I don't think I should get into the technical stuff, but it sounds like what you're doing is exactly what's needed.
Thank you.
Thanks. There's a question from an audience: who normally would be the promoter of this integrated landscape management planning and process?
Yeah.
Where does it start? How does it stick together? You know?
Does it start? What's really been very interesting, because it has not been part of the kind of established institutional processes, in most parts of the world, it has been started by a small number of people, sometimes just 3 or 4 people in a landscape, who are leaders in different sectors, who come together and say, we need a different approach. So it's been, in that sense, it's been very, we even spent the first 10 years of Eco Agriculture Partners on what we called a leadership theory of change, because it really seemed to be the leadership, that people who had the sectoral expertise and respect from others, but had made a commitment internally that they were going to reach out and talk to others from other sectors, and they would develop strong friendships and work together, and they would bring their institutions along for these processes. And I still think it is the kind of work that's more like a community development leader than a technocratic officer. But we are now finding, because of the changes in the politics around this, and because it's become much more mainstreamed and much more acceptable all over the world to national governments than it was 20 years ago, you're now finding government agencies being staffed with people who do have that same passionate commitment to solutions. So that's really what you need. You need people who have a passionate connection with solutions and who have some kind of a convening power, either among their own sector or their own geographies, that they would be respected. So typically it's that combination of the sort of the passionate leaders to the vision, the commitment to the vision of the sustainable future that's driving them, who then manage to engage actors who may not be as passionate, but see the benefit, the pragmatic benefit of doing things. And they then have an effective process of a trusted convener and some skilled facilitation that knows how to not push people into things, but invite them into a discussion and a collaborative process. That is the most common. Now, what's changed in the last 5 years is this institutional, where national governments and international agencies are really interested in supporting landscape partnerships. So the trick there is for them to engage with people who have that legitimacy within their landscape to be leaders as part of the process. So it's very welcome to have a global environment facility program. It's very welcome to have a UNDP or a Green Climate Fund program for landscapes. But if you turn it into just a technocratic process, and you don't have the engagement of people who are passionate about their landscape, then it becomes difficult to build the commitments that are needed to implement it.
Very good, thank you. Oleg, I don't know if you're with us. I see your name. Oleg Dulgarian is with Community Mobilization NGO in the northern part of the country, and he works a lot in the related to the mining sector, and mining sector landscape disruptions have been plenty in Armenia. So Oleg, I don't know if you're with us, and you can also talk in Armenian, though you don't have to, we have translation, you know. Anyway, so maybe I could just formulate the question. We have, you know, massive, you know, damage to landscapes, and some of them are visibly, you know, you can see it very clearly when you drive through mining communities. When you talk about this kind of landscape level restoration, and some of this can also impact on agricultural land and tourism and all the other sectors. Any examples where you've seen this attempt to really bring in the kind of the landscape, you know, damage done by mining into the fold of this integrated landscape management?
Very interestingly, my assumption had been, when I first started asking myself this question, was that it would be very, very difficult. However, in reality, some of the mining groups, particularly the ones that have some sensitivity to international reputation and national reputation, have actually been some of the most enlightened about engaging in these landscape partnerships. And that has been a surprise to me. They recognize, part of it is that they already recognize how damaging what they're doing is, whereas a lot of times agricultural producers are not aware of the environmental damage that they're doing, and that needs to be demonstrated to them before they really are willing to connect. It really does require that the community partners have a sort of a recognized voice in the discussions. It can't just be that the mining company decides what they think they're willing to do to restore lands or whatever. It needs to be a platform. But there's actually quite a lot of experience in the mining sector with the IUCN has been involved in some of the platforms for that. The Global Environment Facility, there's just a new project we're becoming involved in that's funded by the Global Environment Facility, which is about reducing mercury pollution with mining. And they're trying to set that up so that at least half of the places they're working have landscape partnerships to come up with what the action should be. It's a huge challenge, and I think any program to support landscape partnerships should absolutely be including the mining landscapes. But there needs to be a mechanism of strengthening the capacity of the landscape partners to play that role in negotiating their own requirements and articulating them and making sure that they have a really strong background and assessment of what's been actually happening and some of the data. But absolutely a very high priority kind of a place to be doing landscape management. It just all has to do with sometimes, there is a requirement for the government to, having done this assessment, to look at changing some of the mining practices is really going to be kind of critical. It's not just how to do restoration after the damage is done, but can you also influence the mining practices so that they have a less negative effect, or they're done in a different place or whatever.
I guess one of the things that could also kind of vector of input could be that communities themselves may have become resigned to that kind of landscape, morphology that they have, and they don't even think that they could be changed. So maybe from a grassroots level, they can ideas of how this can be restored and changed and put in the community's thinking process, so they can go through and deliberate about the possibilities of restoration, and then it could have a bottom up kind of pressure to start thinking about those. Yeah.
One of the things that has been most powerful globally in terms of motivating and just galvanizing and strengthening community engagement in these questions is actually cross exchanges. It's been very, we did something once even in Japan where we brought in people from other countries who had done some of the integrated landscape management, and they just shared their experiences. And I think identifying, there's dozens of many of these examples of mining places that have at least made some improvements in what they're doing. And maybe pulling together those case examples, maybe bringing in some community leaders from some of those other places who can show them with maps what was done different, so it catalyzes them to think more creatively about their opportunities. I think your point is well taken, and it's not just in mining places, it's in places that have been dominated by other kinds of land uses that don't really help the community. They do not realize that there are models for them to play a more significant role in designing their own landscapes and their own futures. So that's really empowering for them to see other people like themselves. It's not like to bring scientists there. It's to bring people from other peer groups there who can show them that in fact some of these actions were helpful and effective for them. That would be my number one suggestion, because people need to think out of their box. If they only think through their own experience, they won't see all of these options. Doing field trips, bringing groups of community leaders and taking them to places that have more advanced landscape management pieces is actually we've been told it's the most effective tool for getting local people fired up about doing this work.
Thank you. Thank you. There's one question, and quickly, if we could, because we need to go to our panel discussion now. The last question here is by Mariam Acopian, and she's asking about mechanisms that are not punitive, but in fact are encouraging. They're carrots, not sticks. Incentives, tax rate reduction, etc., to encourage this kind of collaboration and integrated planning, landscape planning.
Yeah, no, that's very, very important. I think that integrated landscape management in many parts of the world arose as a solution to failure of regulation. that it just was not possible to implement the regulations and control people for a wide range of reasons. And there has been a big growth in looking at a whole range of incentives, as you mentioned, taxes, but also I am a supporter of well-designed payments for ecosystem services where you reward where the beneficiaries of improved ecosystem services can reward the users, or at least help to cover their costs of making the transition in land management that's needed to achieve them. But there are so many mechanisms of public payments, private payments, sort of low interest loans. There are getting lower interest rates on your loans if you are supporting the landscape, sustainability. There's a very large number of positive incentives that have been done. And one of the things that's interesting is that I think the amount that you need to pay for these is lower than we used to think. Because a lot of what people need is just enough resources to make the internal shifts in their production system and learn and go through the learning process rather than necessarily that they need a lot of funds to do it. Sometimes if you're completely taking them out of production, then they need a lot more resources. But if the issue is to simply help them shift to a more sustainable kinds of production, whether that's agriculture, agro-processing, or mining, or whatever, then I think those positive incentives are much more effective, most cases, than regulation, just because of the difficulty of enforcing regulation and the fact that most regulations are not tailored enough to the specific situation to be the most effective way of influencing behavior.
Thank you very much. I'm sharing my screen now. Let's wrap up with the questions, and I want to invite our panelists, Arman Khojoyan, Deputy Minister of Economy of the Republic of Armenia. Regrettably, Anna Mazmanyan, the Deputy Minister of Environment, was busy with some government last-minute stuff, and she apologized she cannot join us. Hovik Sayadyan, Sustainable Land Use Advisor for GIZ, the German Development Agency. Narina Avetyan, Head of Territorial Programs and Capital Investment Programs and Solid Waste Management at the Territorial Administration Infrastructure of Republic of Armenia. And I believe Nina Petrosyan is also with us from Deputy Chair of the Urban Development, Urban Planning Committee of the Republic of Armenia. So if we could, those panelists, if you could turn on your cameras, would greatly appreciate it. And Nune, I believe you were with us as well. Yeah, Narine. And Gohar, if maybe they have stepped away, if you can call them and remind them that we're starting the panel. Oh, Narine, there you are. Yes. Okay, and Nune, if also Gohar could see, if you could see if Nune Petrosyan is also able to join us. But anyway, let me start. Thanks a lot, everyone. Mr. Khojoyan, Mr. Avetyan, Mr. Sayadyan, and Sarah, thanks a lot for staying and having a discussion focused now Armenia with landscape, integrated landscape management and the idea of agriculture. One of your very provocative points was it's no longer about ecosystems versus agriculture, it's how we manage ecosystems while we do agriculture, and it's through agriculture, because the way we're using land, humans are dominating use of land. It's no longer an option given the size of the populations and our consumption patterns that we'll be able to just only have protected areas for nature and everything else we can use however we want. That solution may not be the only solution. So Mr. Khojoyan, I know you think about the issues of land a lot, there's been a certain legacy of land distribution in Armenia post-Soviet Union. Any thoughts about integrated landscape management approach in Armenia, and how does that fit into what the Armenian government currently is thinking about land reform, land use, and so on, and agriculture specifically, please?
Thank you very much, Alan, for inviting me for this very interesting discussion. I was really enjoying Sarah's presentation and also the questions raised by the audience. It was Sarah just mentioned all the required activities that the policymakers should pay attention or to draw their attention. So I think at some point I will be a little bit repeated because she visualized even all the required steps. So yes, you're right. Currently, one of the impediments for agriculture growth is the land management, agricultural land management. Unfortunately, currently, around 52% of agricultural land is unused. So we are talking about abandoned land, which are causes for land degradation. And also just a brief statistics about what's going on currently, and then I will continue what are the actions we are taking or we are thinking about. So around 60% of landowners is owning up to 1 hectare of land. And around 80% of landowners and plus additional 20% owns the landowners is owning land from 1 to 2 hectares. So it means that 80% of Armenian landowners is owning land up to 2 hectares. This is what we are talking about, a fragmented land, fragmented use of land and inefficient agriculture. So in order to increase the agriculture efficiency, we need to pay attention to 2 things. First, this is the productivity. So productivity in agriculture that contributes to GDP is around $4.3 per person hour. So it means that if we are comparing to the membering state countries of Eurasian Economic Union, it is $11.7. In European member countries, it is $43.3. Like separately considering like Luxembourg is 133.3. So the comparison shows that the productivity is very low in Armenia, so we should pay attention to the productivity. And one of the reasons that we think about the land reform, it is how we can bring the unused land into cultivation as well as increase the productivity. Because as Sarah mentioned in the presentation, one of the key points, it is increasing also the productivity, as well as we should also pay attention how we are consulting farmers, how we communicate with farmers in order to convey this understanding that also they should pay attention to the biodiversity, and the biodiversity that they can reach, it is also increasing the yield, because changing the crops, this is also supporting the land, not squeezing it till the end. So we initiated together with FAO, and currently we are planning to have a land reform conference at the beginning of November. We will be invited also our partners, World Bank, FAO, as well as many international organizations to share also their experience, because we are at the momentum of deciding which direction we go. One of the things that we are thinking about is creating a land agency, which will be in charge of all that activities. So as Sarah also mentioned in the presentation, this activity should be centralized and controlled. And this is very much important. Currently, we do have a policy in place, but it is not working because there are too many implementers of that policy, and so it is not being regulated and supervised by one organization or an institution. So one thing, it is creating a land agency, which will become kind of play an intermediary role between the farmers as well as the investors, creating also an effective platform for investments. Ellen, please stop me when I talk too much, because this is one of the topics that I can talk or communicate the whole allowed period of time. So please stop me when you think that I'm running too far.
No, that's fine. I think you're still highlighting the key elements of the thinking of the government. So let's continue and then.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you much. So one of the key elements it is that the land agency should be also considering purchasing land and also consolidating, creating infrastructure, making an attractive plots for the investors as well. So this is one of the things that we are thinking about, attracting investments, creating infrastructure. The other thing it is how we apply policy to those not touching the property rights of farmers. So just applying appropriate policy, making them either to rent or to give to rent the land that they don't use, or to sell to an investor, because this is kind of an issue that there are many land, around 38% of the unused land is just abandoned land. And some of the reasons it is that people who are rich, who don't have any kind of interaction with agriculture, they could afford buying a land just in case. There are some people who left Armenia and still they are owning land, but this land is unused. So we are creating kind of environment, also policy, first of all, to identify the land, the unused land, to identify the reasons why these land are unused, and then after to apply the policy that will be needed. This is one of the things. The other thing it is that we are in cooperation also. I will today, during my talk, I will be listing Sarah's points. We brought together all the representatives from different institutions. As Sarah mentioned, there was missing the cadastre. We also involved cadastre, the Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Territorial Administration. Our ministry is in charge for agriculture and the economy as well. So we attracted many representatives of different institutions in order to create a cumulative approach, a united approach towards the landscape, integrated landscape management. And one of the things that the cadastre initiated, and I think this is a move forward, step forward, it is that currently they are doing the mapping, updating the cadastre maps. And with those, we are trying to create an access to the community, to the communities, and giving an access to these ortho photos to communities so that they can manage these areas by themselves. And also, like if an investor or someone goes to a community, so the community already knows what is the current situation of their area, and by knowing them, at least creating a platform for them and understanding, knowing them, managing them, seeing it on a map in their screen, it will, we do believe that it will still will only just doing that will increase their willingness to manage the landscape, to see where are the missing elements, and then being in charge of the communities, bring them together. So maybe this much in brief. And then,
good. Thank you, Mr. Khojayan. You know, we could do this several ways. I mean, Sarah, you can respond, or we can go to other comments, collect comments and thoughts, and then maybe maybe have a discussion afterwards. Is that okay, Sarah? Is that a better way of doing it? Yeah.
Whatever you think works.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe just on one topic, if you can pick up, Sarah, and we can you can comment on one of the things Arman Khojayan said, please.
No, there was a couple of things that were very exciting to hear about your kind of united all of government support strategy, which I think is really, you know, really valuable. And I think your challenge of the smallholders is one that's shared by quite a lot of countries in the world. And some, you know, sometimes it's a land reform solution, sometimes it's a market cooperative, et cetera, solution to it. But I think there's a lot of models out there for that. One thing that I wanted to just flag was this issue of unused land. Because as you say, there's a lot of production potential in that unused land. One of the things that we found in some other countries that have tried to make sure that all the unused land converted to production was that some of those lands actually played really important roles in watershed protection or wildlife habitat. And so in fact, it wasn't desirable to have all of it shift over. So just something to keep in mind that when we're doing land reform, it was kind of the point I was making about also looking at what's going to happen to ecosystem services. And we have a couple countries that did their land reforms 20 or 30 years ago, and this is causing them really big problems now because they can't redo it. But you're in a fortunate situation where you can actually incorporate that, from the early stages of your strategy.
Thank you. There's, the small land holders and farmers, of course, is a huge issue, both ethical and also political issue, because we want any kind of growth to be inclusive and for the small farmers to benefit from any kind of agricultural growth or any growth that takes place. So Ms. Hoxhayan mentioned some of the elements. Ms. Narnavetyan from Ministry of Territorial Administration, I know you're running the subvention program, the subsidy program to the communities. They're not always necessarily directed towards land use and land reform, but any sense from your ministry's perspective about how you can ensure that there's some kind of a redistribution that happens that that protects the small farmers and in their communities and helps them become economically more competitive. And you can speak in Armenian, of course, if you wish. So. And I know you're very good in English, but just in case. You need to, yeah.
If you don't mind, yes, please, I will speak in Armenian, if you don't mind, which is
yes, please, and you can go to the translation to the Armenian version.
Yes, yes, շնորհակալություն եմ հայտնում այս կոնֆերանսի համար եւ շատ կարեւոր թեմա է։ Անկեղծ ասած, ես չգիտեմ քաղաքաշինության կոմիտեից ներկա են թե չէ, ուղղակի միջև անցնել մեր նախարարությանը, ես կցանկանայի նշել, որ քաղաքաշինության կոմիտեն բավականին աշխատանքներ տարել է լանդշաֆտների պլանավորման գործընթացում, նաև վերջին 6-7 տարիների ընթացքում կոնվենցիային միացել են, բավականին փաստաթղթեր են մշակվել տարածական պլանավորման գործընթացներում եւ ինչի արդյունք է, որ այս 2-3 տարին արդեն իսկ մշակվում է բոլոր մարզերի համար միկրոռեգիոնալ մակարդակի համակցված տարածական պլանավորման փաստաթղթերը որոշ մարզերին արդեն իսկ հաստատվել են, դա արվում է տարբեր գերատեսչությունների ներգրավմամբ եւ անցնում է իհարկե շրջակա միջավայրի ազդեցության գնահատումը, աշխատանքներ արվում է եւ այդ փաստաթղթերը բավականին լուրջ փաստաթղթեր են բազմակողմանի ուսումնասիրություններով եւ առաջարկություններով։ Պարոն Ամիրխանյան, ինչ վերաբերում է ձեր կողմից բարձրացված հարցին, ես ինչպես նաև նախորդի համար բավականին քննարկում է եւ տարբեր նախարարությունների մոտ այդ հողօգտագործների հետ կապված լքված տարածքների դրան եմ ուզում անդրադառնալ տարբեր ինստիտուտներում էլ քննարկել ուղղակի այստեղ մենք միշտ հանդիպում ենք այն հարցին, որ մենք ունենում ենք սեփականության իրավունքի հետ խնդիր որոշ նույնիսկ փոխվարչապետի մոտ էլ քննարկումներ են եղել, հնարավորություններ գտնել, որոշ ժամկետ եթե ոչ մի ներդրում չի արվում, հողը չի օգտագործվում, հնարավորություն լինի այդ ետ վերցնել, պարոն Խոջոյանը շատ ավելի լավ գիտի այդ քննարկումները։ Ինչ վերաբերում է տարածքային կառավարման եւ ենթակառուցվածքների նախարարության գործունեությանը, ինչպես գիտեք, մեր հիմնական գործունեությունը դա համաչափ զարգացում ապահովելն է հանրապետությունում եւ այս աշխարհաքաղաքական սահմանափակումներով հիմա բոլորս գիտենք, որ Հայաստանի տարածքային անհամաչափությունները պայմանավորված են եւ կլիմայական առանձնահատկություններով եւ տարբեր ռեսուրսների անհամաչափ բաշխմամբ սոցիալական, ժողովրդագրական եւ այդ անհամաչափությունները, ինչը շատ կենսական անհրաժեշտություն է այս պահի համար դարձել, մեր կողմից որոշակի քայլեր են նախաձեռնվում եւ ձեռնարկվում են այդ ինչը հիմա կենտրոնացած է Երևանի վրա, եւ սոցիալապես եւ տնտեսական աճ ավելի շատ ուրբանիզացիա մեզ մոտ շատ բարձր է, քանի որ ամբողջ հանրապետության 60 եւ ավելի տոկոսը բնակվում է բնակչության քաղաքային բնակավայրերում, իսկ եւ ամբողջ տնտեսական զարգացումը հիմնականում սոցիալ-տնտեսական աճը դրված է Երևանի վրա։ Որպեսզի այդ անհամաչափությունը մի փոքր մեղմացվի, կառավարության կողմից մի շարք միջոցներ են ձեռնարկվում հեռավար համայնքների զարգացման ուղղված տարբեր ենթակառուցվածքների եւ զարգացման, ինչը եւ նշեց պարոն Ամիրխանյանը, մենք իրականացնում ենք համայնքների ենթակառուցվածքների զարգացման ուղղված սուբվենցիոն ծրագիրը, որը իրենից ներկայացնում է մի ծրագիր, որը պետությունը աջակցում է բոլոր համայնքների ենթակառուցվածքների զարգացմանը, դա կլինի եւ ճանապարհներ, եւ լուսավորություն, եւ մանկապարտեզների համայնքային շենքերի կառուցում, եւ ջրամատակարարման ցանցի ստեղծում, ոռոգման համակարգի ներդրում եւ այլն, տեխնիկայի գնում, ինչպես նաեւ գյուղատնտեսական եւ կոմունալ տնտեսության համար։ Բավականին աշխատանքներ այս ուղղությամբ արվել են, այս 3 տարվա մեջ մենք մոտ 1200 ծրագիր իրականացրել ենք, մեծ գումարներ են ներդրվել նաև պետության կողմից եւ համայնքների կողմից եւ մասնավորի կողմից, այս համագործակցությունը նույնպես այստեղ կսեմ նշել, որ կա, ինչպես մեր Վիգեն Սարան նշում էր։ Եվ նաև մենք ուղղվածություն ունենք այս սուբվենցիոն ծրագրերը նաև տնտեսական զարգացման համար ուղղվածությունը տանք, որպեսզի նաև ոչ միայն սոցիալական, նաև տնտեսական զարգացումը ունենանք։ Բացի դրանից, եթե թույլ կտայք, ուզենայի խոսել նաև էկոհամակարգի մասին, ինչպես նշվեց, մենք նաև աղբահանության ոլորտում իրականացնում ենք որոշակի ծրագրեր։ Եթե թույլ տաք ասեմ, մոտ 3-4 տարի առաջ ուսումնասիրությունների շրջանակներում հայտ էր եկել, որ հանրապետությունում ձևավորվել է շուրջ 2030 աղբանոցակ, որոնք գրավում են մոտ 500 հեկտար, ինչը մեր Հայաստանի փոքր երկրի համար տարածքային իհարկե առումով փոքր նկատի ունեմ 500 հեկտարը, որը մենք ունեինք աղբանոցների համար, բավականին շատ մեծ թիվ է, որը չի օգտագործվում եւ վնասում է շրջակա միջավայրը եւ նաեւ մարդու առողջությանը։ Որոշ ձեռնարկված միջոցների արդյունքներում մենք փորձեցինք համայնքների հետ 1700 աղբանոցները փակել, բավականին տարածքներ ազատվեցին, իրենք ամբողջովին չեն կոնսերվացվել, հողածածկում են արվել եւ նախատեսվում է նաեւ համապատասխան բուսականություններ այնտեղ աճեցնել եւ նաեւ ցանկանում եմ նշել, որ Ամերիկյան համալսարանի Acopian Նապաստանական կենտրոնի աջակցությամբ մենք տարեկես առաջ նույնպես մասնակցային աղբավայրերի բազա ստեղծեցինք եւ այդ բազայի հիման վրա մենք այսօր ունենք մոտավորապես 300 աղբավայր եւ ցանկանում եմ նշել, որ կառավարության կողմից այժմ աշխատանքներ են տարվում, որպեսզի Հայաստանում ընդհանրենք այդ ամբողջ ունեցած բոլոր աղբանոցները, քանի որ իրենք ուղղակի աղբի կուտակման վայր են, իրենք աղբավայր չեն, իրենք չեն համապատասխանում ոչ մի բնապահպանական, քաղաքաշինական, սանիտարական ոչ մի նորմերի եւ հանրապետությունում ներդնել շուրջ ունենալ առավելագույնը 5-ից 6 սանիտարական աղբավայր, իսկ այդ բոլոր աղբանոցները փակել եւ տարածքներ ազատել, ինչը հնարավոր է նաեւ օգտագործել շատ ավելի արդյունավետ ուղղությամբ։ Եթե ինչ-որ հարցերում
Անդրադան հետ վերադառնանք խոսենք։ Yeah. Sarah, maybe, and there's a lot here to discuss, but maybe about this state subsidy programs and subventions, if you will, to rural communities. any way to think about linking this to integrated landscape management, so that you only don't get a transfer, but also you get some kind of development outcome from it. I don't know, Sarah, if you heard my question. Yeah.
Oh, I thought your question was to Nareen.
No,
Okay.
no.
Yeah, no, that's fine. No, thank you very much for it was great to learn about the work that you're doing on territorial programs. Really very exciting. And I think it provides the framework that makes it actually much easier to do integrated landscape management, as you were saying. I think that micro region is kind of a good scale of operation, and it facilitates bringing in local people into that. And I think that is one of the question that was made before about the incentives. I think that using the subsidies in a strategic way to support the movement toward more integrated outcomes is a real opportunity that I know is being explored in many parts of the world. That shift in the nature of the rural subsidies to be ones that provide not only income support but the transformation of the economy. And I think the point you're making in a place like Armenia, with the point that was made by your colleague, Mr. Koyajan, about the low productivity, it's really clear that economic growth and income increases is going to be really central. So any subsidies should be, you can think of them as income supports, but it's also would be good if they became catalysts of local investment. The one point that I wanted to make about the small scale of farming is to encourage you to think, to some extent, there are some benefits to having somewhat smaller farms. If you think of the large grain agriculture, which the machinery, et cetera, requires large scale properties, the new approaches for diversified farming systems, where you would have multiple crops within a farm, are actually more easily managed with smaller farm sizes, because they require more attention to be paid to the farm, the pieces of the farm management, and it's hard to do in really large properties. So there are some possibilities for that, and I realize that may be something for the future, but it is interesting to think about if we're moving toward more diversified farming systems, that has implications for the optimal size of properties that would be managed. Just that's experience from elsewhere anyway.
Thank you. Ms. Avetian, did you want to add something? You were raising your hand.
Ես ուղղակի սուբվենցիաների մասով կցանկանայի նաև նշել, այստեղ կարևորը ինչումն է, որ ոչ միայն պետությունը ուղղակի սուբվենցիա է տրամադրում, հա, այստեղ համայնքը մասնակցային պարտադիր պահանջով նաև հանրային լսումների արդյունքներով ներկայացնում է, որ իրեն անհրաժեշտ է այսինչ հողատարածք հասանք ջրարբիացնել, հա, կամ ջրամատակարարում քաշել, կամ լուսավորություն անել, կամ գյուղատնտեսական տեխնիկա ձեռք բերել, որը այսքան հեկտար հողատարածք մշակի։ Այսինքն այստեղ ոչ թե պետությունը ուղղակի տրամադրում, այլ համայնքը ինքն է նախաձեռնում, ինքը իր համայնքում քննարկում է, գտնում է, որ դա կարևորագույն խնդիր է, եւ ինչը մենք նաև քննարկում ենք տարբեր գերատեսչությունների հետ եւ գյուղատնտեսության ոլորտի եւ քաղաքաշինության եւ ճանապարհային, որպեսզի ավելի արդյունավետ այն իրականացվի։ Շնորհակալություն,
Shnakalachan, thank you. Mr. Sayadian, you have been around a long time in developing programs, policy, analyzing impacts from the forestry sector to agriculture sector, and now you've also now you're currently involved with a very large basin, the Lake Savan Basin, which sorry, Mariam, can you please Acopian? And so you've been involved in this Lake Savan Basin land use related issues and the huge impact land use has on very important freshwater resource like Lake Savan. So given what you heard from Mr. Khojoyan and Ms. Avetian, I don't want to necessarily prompt you to criticize, but what would you alarm policymakers about what to look out for? You know.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for this nice discussions. Actually, I got very important and valuable highlights for our European Union for Lake Savan project, where I'm responsible for sustainable land use. I would like to say that I'm happy that what we are doing at the moment, at least within our component, it well sounds to what Mr. Khojoyan highlighted and what Sarah also highlighted. I'm talking about diversification of cultivation of agricultural crops. That is one highlight actually that we are doing in Lake Savan Basin and taking into account the climate change impact. And there we are going to, and we are actually introducing new agricultural crops with shorter rotation period, which are more resistant to droughts, and thanks to short rotation period, they are not very demanding on water consumption. The other highlights that I would like to say is increasing of efficiency of cultivation of current agricultural crops like potato, cabbage, carrots that are widespread in Lake Savan Basin, and increasing of efficiency is done by local resources, by using organic fertilizer locally produced and by using local soil improvers, minerals like bentonite or zeolite that are produced in Armenia, and using special technology that is tested already by Agrarian University of Armenia. We're happy to say that now we have a good results from Lake Savan Basin, and actually we are on our way to bring it to high level to decision makers and to have some, let's say, key challenging decisions for application of synthetic fertilizers in Lake Savan Basin. We will do all these things on the base of our scientific calculations. And the other highlight that I would like to mention, it is cultivation of non-used agricultural lands. It is plenty in Lake Savan Basin also, and for that purpose, we actually trying to introduce two different tools in the region. The first one is regenerative agriculture, Sarah mentioned in her presentation. Regenerative agriculture, it's a totally new approach for Armenia. Actually, it was just piloted in one region in Ararat Valley, but what we are going to do is increase soil health through cover crops and through integrated livestock management. And the mechanism there is to use rotational grazing. So we hope that this pilot is very scalable, and we intended to introduce this pilot in this autumn and coming spring. We have other references from Ararat Valley, Aragat-Sotan region, and hopefully the interest towards this technology will increase. And the other technology for bringing unused agricultural lands into cultivation is agroforestry systems. At the moment, we are working on local subsidy, and we have already allocated land for that purpose. That is to try to integrate advantages of forest ecosystem management and also some agricultural systems. So integration of agriculture and forestry, which used to be contradictory, it will actually provide us good chance to have a sustainable and integrated land management. With our these piloted projects, we are just trying to build up some very good cases which could actually support decision makers to scale up all our activities from Lake Savan Basin or other parts of Armenia for the country-wise. Maybe that much. So far, if any question, I would be happy to clarify.
Thank you. And of course, you know, Mr. Saadian, how much of these new pilots and new initiatives are easily understood and adopted by farmers? Do you think this could be something, what would be the challenges in adoption, and especially as it goes to the level of thinking about landscape management? Do you see the local communities being able to absorb these ideas and being able to start thinking about landscape level and bigger impacts of their activities?
Very good question. Actually, I have two answers for that. In the first case, farmers are happy with short-term investment, for instance, with diversification of agricultural crops, because project investigated and then provided these crops and demonstrated the social economic benefit of cultivation. And also the same with efficiency increasing by using organic fertilizers and by using these soil ameliorants. But as for regenerative agriculture, it is very difficult to perceive farmer that you can actually graze all your animals, let's say 20 heads on 1 hectare for 6 or 8 months continuously, because they are using special technology, special cover crops, and then it will work. So fortunately, we have a good example from Ararat Valley, and we already organized a demonstration for these farmers. And as for agroforest, it also a bit difficult because agroforest system, it needs a few years, 1, 2, sometimes 3 years before it will give some initial results. All our farmers, they are keen to do anything, but they have to see it to be sure that really it is working.
Right. Thanks. And yes, Mr. Hojayan, go ahead.
Actually, I'm very sorry to intervene. I don't know how to raise a hand in this Zoom platform. That's why I just switch on my microphone and ask for a comment. Okay,
that's
great.
fine. You can also do this. That's fine.
Great. Just want also to comment, Alan, because you raised very important question, how easily all these frontier technologies or introduced technologies are understood, and what is very much important, applied by farmers. And I know that Mr. Savan knows very well, and whatever topic he touched, the rotational grazing, the diversified cultivation of crops are very much important. But one of the issues that we are currently facing, it is the scaling up whatever is reached in small areas or in small projects. And this is also something that we should combine our efforts together with all players in the field to understand how we need to scale it up. One of the things also that Sarah mentioned in her presentation, this was related to scarce of water resources as well as efficient water usage. And if we are talking about, this is something that because of the climate change, we are facing this problem is more visible, even among farmers. And currently the government has state support programs. This is a cashback program. If you apply this drip irrigation systems, then you can receive around 30% of cashback. So, but we see that very low involvement from farmer side. And then we did a little bit research to understand what is really a problem. And we got to the result, we identified that because of this fragmented land, the cost of application of these drip irrigation systems is very high. Per hectare, it is around $5,000. And this is because the filtering systems, the pumps, the reservoirs are costing much. If this is applied only once, then the cost for 1 hectare will be around $700 or $1,000. So this is only 20%. And imagine if the government is paying you back 50% of that already your cost. And also there is currently another state project which will be approved very soon. This is if you apply this drip irrigation systems at your plot, then you will be free of this water fee, annual water fee. So it means that this is becoming very beneficial. But therefore, Ms. Avetian mentioned about this community-based programs that the government is supporting the communities to establish an infrastructure for their communities. And we proposed that to increase that level, that 80% will be provided by government if the community wants to establish a unified water system. This is the filtering, the pumps. So the unified water system, the government will be paying, so that we can make sure that after the system is available in the community, then after the farmers will be they can afford applying this $1,000 fee and the 50% cashback, $500 fee for having the drip irrigation system on place. This is very important for us, a new initiative, and we think that by doing this also, yes, of course, we will start with some projects targeting some special communities, but we do believe that this can be something that will be applied massively, because currently we see that very low application of these frontier drip irrigation technologies are being applied by farmers.
Okay, if I could just thank you very much. Going back to landscape management, I want to be a little provocative, Mr. Hojoyan. You talked about a lot of interagency collaboration, right? I'm assuming that also includes the Urban Development Committee and their landscape spatial planning work that's been done. But to what extent have communities been involved in this planning process? And maybe your answer is that in Armenia it's impossible to do community planning, or it is, we've tried it. Just like an honest answer about community engagement, because Sarah's main point is that multi-stakeholder engagement is critical to integrated landscape management. So what has been multi-stakeholder? It can't just be interagency, right? So go ahead, please.
Very interesting question. This is not provocative. This is to the point question. The head of communities were involved in the discussion. There was a special group was established by a decree of the Ministry of Economy, and I was heading the group. And there were there were NGOs also involved and two community leaders. And what was interesting in the discussions, that sometimes the community leaders, the head of the communities, were saying that, have you ever been to the group members? Have you ever been to communities? Do you really understand the needs of the communities? So this is like they were bringing them back to reality when the group was trying to very quickly shift into a theoretical part of solving problems. So the head of communities, they were bringing, of course, we have chosen advanced ones, hoping that the advanced head of communities, the knowledgeable ones who have not a limited understanding of community development, but a broader understanding, creativity level is beyond the expectations. So that's why we could reach interesting results, which make us to initiate a conference for November that also the head of communities will be able to share their understanding, their point of view, how they see this development. So even the community members were, the community heads were sharing with us that, you know, they use the Google Earth for mapping, for drawing these areas of unused areas and then trying to manage it, and also sharing information that, for example, the neighboring community head is even a little bit uneducated, and for him it will be very difficult to use the computer or this kind of new technologies, the GIS systems, etc. So also they are not only sharing that they can do, they are also sharing information that they know about the communities, about the real situation in the communities. But representatives from the from the Ministry of Territorial Administration, they made us sure that this centralization of these communities and centralized governing of the communities will allow to increase the budget, will allow to engage necessary or required experts in the communities, and giving the appropriate tools and also having working policy in place will lead us to the targeted results.
Okay, Sarah, can I provoke you to ask questions? I mean, here we have a central government, we have regional governments, we have local governments actively involved. We don't have private sector, we don't have civil society.
Actually, we do have a private sector. SPICA was involved in the discussions as well. SPICA was involved, and
the largest food exporter in the country.
Yeah, and because also they are like dealing very much with farmers. They know about the fragmented land. They know how it is hard to deal with farmers and to organize an export, massive export. So the representative of SPICA was engaged in it, and also from civil society. I don't know the English, the term in geodesia. There is a new foundation, experts from this very specific.
They're GIS experts, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, more or less GIS experts. Yeah, GIS experts were engaged as well.
Okay, hopefully we'll be invited to the November land reform discussion. Thank you. Sarah, go ahead. Yeah.
Sure. No, this is really very interesting, both to hear Hovik's presentation and the more recent contributions of Arman. A couple of thoughts came up for me. Let me first just make some reference to Hovik's comments, and that is that this. If you recall, when I was talking about the 5 elements, not the 5 elements, the 5 features of integrated landscape management, one of them is that all the different land managers are managing for multiple objectives, not just one. And so I think the kind of research that's going on there of these kinds of innovative management systems are really, they are the critical building blocks for landscape management. You need to be having kind of solutions in different parts of the system. So those things are really including the drip irrigation reference in terms of finding solutions. I wanted to just reference that the experience from very many places around the world is that farmers do need support to make the transition. You're referencing the agroforestry systems and the grazing systems. They need at least some often small financial ones, but most importantly, they're finding that smallholders do not adopt as individuals. They adopt as groups within their own, their own communities, because they kind of need the moral support. They need the social approval to do the kinds of changes, because often the old traditional farming systems are culturally important. And so it's hard for individuals to make the change without seeming like they're rejecting their cultures and their communities. So I just wanted to talk, maybe about encouraging you to explore using a group process for those transitions. And then I wanted to mention, in relationship to agroforestry, which is one of my passions, it's something I've been involved with for many, many decades, working more in the tropics, is that when one moves from a farm level, income-oriented, adaptation-oriented, local farm level adaptation-oriented approach to agroforestry, that bringing in the landscape perspective can be quite important, because especially I think of Armenia as being very, very hilly and mountainous. Agroforestry systems can be much more sustainable, much better protectors of watersheds, much better protectors of wildlife, much better storage of carbon, which means you could potentially get carbon credits from it, et cetera. However, in the wrong parts of the watershed, they can actually take in too much water. Lowered often. So just thinking about the landscape applications of agroforestry, just spatially within landscapes, is something to pay attention to. I also wanted to mention, in terms of the community, the idea of building the infrastructure for communities, which is really very exciting for me to hear. I think this kind of adaptation of infrastructure for the needs of the community is really key. I wanted to point out that in other parts of the world, many places have not paid adequate attention to how that infrastructure will be maintained after it's built and after it's created. Just wanted to share that with you all, that as you're thinking of the planning for it, it's not just the where are we going to put it and what are we going to use, but it's what is the system to keep the system maintained. Otherwise it falls apart. I also wanted to suggest, in terms of the adoption of these new systems, again, to go back, and this maybe speaks to Armand's comment about participation. It sounds like you had a very positive experience bringing in community leaders. My first reaction is to say that's a great start, but one would want to see those kinds of multi-stakeholder committees in all the different features of what you're moving forward. I would be encouraging of that. It's not just a few advanced community leaders. It really is that you need the endorsement and the input from a pretty wide range of community leaders. And I would include local business leaders in that as well. Even if there's small scale business community, bringing them in can be extremely important, as well as bringing in, kind of the organized NGOs, groups in that. And I think it's not bringing them in just for the occasional consultation, but to think about an institutional mechanism that you could put in place, that such consultations and collaborative design is built into the system. So it's not just a few people who get involved, but it's thousands of people that get involved across the, depending upon what's relevant. But I think it sounds like you had a good start. Maybe you've learned some things about how to do that process well. But I do think that if you want the communities to get really behind the approach, and you don't want it to go so slowly, the adoption process, figuring out a way to get community mobilization can be really helpful, and bringing in all of those diverse groups. I did want to clarify that when you say community, that's a different thing from local governments, right? You're thinking those are more like farmer organizations and things like that. Can you just clarify that?
No, the local governments.
So when you say community, okay, because in many parts of the world, the community is something under the local governments. So, okay, so I would say then local governments are 1 out of 10 parts of a community. So they're very important. And they are not the only ones that are taking land use decisions and investment decisions. So I would encourage you then to say not only I think for territorial development, the role of local governments is really important, and they need to be strengthened to play that role. And they need to have support from the higher levels of government to play that role. But certainly, I guess in my view, that's not the community perspective. That the community is a much broader than the government actors. If you can, if you can bring them in, and if you can, things tend to move much more quickly once you actually get to action on the ground. You can develop the plan faster without them. But then you have this problem that it takes longer to implement the plan than it would if you brought them in a little bit earlier. That's at least the experience in other parts of the world. Yeah.
Ms. Savetian, can I just jump in? And your experience, of course, you worked a lot with local communities. The challenge often with local communities is know-how, skills on the one hand, but on the other hand, inadequate kind of legislative kind of ground infrastructure, if you will, to get something like this happening. Sarah has been talking a lot about informal kind of organizing, self-organizing. In Armenia, my experience, a lot of self-organizing happens, but when it comes to interacting with state bodies, informal has no role. So how do you see this in any way changing? Can informal bodies and structures and the processes have some kind of input into formal government decisions? Sorry, this was not a question we had agreed upon, but I'm improvising, so go ahead.
Շնորհակալություն։ Ես ցանկանում եմ նշել, որ վերջին եթե մենք համեմատություն Եթե մենք համեմատության կարգով անենք, օրինակի համար նույնիսկ վերցնելով սուբվենցիոն ծրագրերի հայտերը, որ ներկայացնում էին, համայնքները 18 թվականին ու ներկայացնում են հիմա, ու քննարկումները իրենց հետ, ես կարող եմ ասել, մենք շատ մեծ տարբերություն ունենք, որտեղ համայնքներում արդեն կարողություններ զարգանում են, նամանավանդ այն խոշոր համայնքներում, եւ իրենք ներգրավում են այս քննարկումների մեջ։ Ինչպես պարոն Խոջյանը նշեց, գիտեք, որ դեկտեմբերի 5-ի նախատեսվում է մեզ մոտ համայնքների խոշորացումը եւ այս պարագայում մենք ունենանք արդեն 77 համայնք բավականին մեծ թվով բնակավայրերի ներգրավմամբ, ինչը մեզ թույլ է տալիս, որ համայնքներում արդեն ունենալ ավելի պրոֆեսիոնալ մասնագետներ տարբեր ուղղություններով, եւ քաղաքաշինական եւ գյուղատնտեսական, ինչը հիմա ասենք մենք շատ փոքր համայնքներում բացակայում են այդ մասնագետները, փորձում ենք նաև տարածքային կառավարման, այսինքն մարզպետարանների միջոցով, նաև մեր գերատեսչությունների միջոցով աջակցել եւ նաև համայնքների պարտադիր ներգրավել այս զարգացումների մեջ։ Կարծում եմ, որ այս գործընթացները, որ կառավարությունը նախաձեռնել է, բավականին մենք դրական արդյունքներ կունենանք, տեսանելի կլինի մեր կարծիքով։
Sarah, any reactions, any feedback?
Were you speaking to me, Alan?
Yeah. Sorry, I maybe I mumbled. Yeah, sorry.
That's okay. No, I think that what Nadine is just describing is really an excellent start. I think having, I guess if you're saying the communities are the local government representatives, I think it sounds like you are developing a mechanism for them to have systematic input into the process. I would have a question about whether they are just asking for support and you are figuring out what the options are for them to ask for. It would be interesting to look at also having them have an input into the development of the program of offerings of support. So I don't know to what extent you've been able to do that. It sounds like there's a little bit, but not necessarily a whole lot of that. And I think bringing in the professional experts, say in water or agriculture, is really important. Again, I would say it would be very interesting to bring in some of the businesses, the local businesses that are also potentially in there, and can you be building some of that expertise within the communities would be something that I would be very, very interested to see. I'm also a little unclear on where are there farmer organizations and associations in Armenia, or do you really have to work with them individual by individual?
Mr. Khodian,
Maybe someone could clarify that for me.
Yeah, actually, there are many farmer organizations in Armenia. Also, there are around registered 528 cooperatives. And if we are talking about this, the groups, we also consider the farmer cooperatives as well. Like this can be also association, this can be a cooperative. And out of these 528 registered cooperatives, this is my subjective opinion, I think that only 10 are really working and matches the understanding of a cooperative. This is organically, they are cooperating with each other. Of course, there were some policy issues that we made some revisions also in 2020 year, making them more appropriate conditions for them to operate. But however, still the idea of cooperative or finding cooperative solutions still is not working. Mainly why these 528 cooperatives were established, because international organizations, when they want to do a project, they were motivating farmers to initiate groups, to create groups, and the groups were being registered as cooperatives. But unfortunately, this was not a sustainable project. And after the end of the project, the sustainability issue was in there. And so we are currently facing that still we don't have satisfied quantity of working cooperatives. There were even farmers associations available in Armenia, which only one person introduced the association. So this is another tragedy for Armenia, because a person is representing through media himself that he is representing, for example, Grape Producers Association, and listeners, the auditorium, they think that this person is conveying the word of the grape producers, and he is the president of Grape Producers Associations, but he is a one representative, or with his friends are representing or naming him as an association. So there are different issues also related to the associations and cooperatives. There are existing associations and cooperatives, but only few are operating well.
Yeah, that sounds like quite a challenge, because you're also looking at the whole, I mean, I think it is this challenge overall of strengthening local organization in diverse ways. That is something that benefits a lot from training and awareness raising and those kinds of things. And it does seem like that is something that even the local governments could, as you're strengthening their support, bringing in some of the farm organizations. I think those are the ones that, having at least some of the voices of farmers, obviously associations is the best, but if you don't, then knowing transparently that it's just a person speaking for their own interests, at least they might be able to be part of the conversation about what some of those local solutions should be and how it will benefit local people. I think going back to this question of visiting together, it sounds like because you're not in a developed stage there. First of all, I wanted to say to Alan, I think that you're right. I think when you start wanting to influence policy, then you need more formal organization of these landscape partnerships. The problem is that sometimes then you get into governance, people, then there's a reason to fight over the leadership, whereas they work most effectively with distributed leadership, leaders from the business community, leaders from the farmer organizations, leaders from the Water Users Association, et cetera. But that being said, especially during this period where those are not really well formed, the possibility of the policymakers being able to spend more time in field visits where there is a systematic focus groups with different stakeholder groups responding and contributing ideas is often a very good early stage. Getting people used to discussing their future together as a way of building these collaboratives, both farmer organizations, community organizations, whatever it might be, whether it's, you're talking about the drip irrigation approach, which sounds really very interesting. I'd love to learn more about that. But again, managing a community-wide water system requires skills in collaborative management. And so kind of strengthening that aspect of it at the same time that you're strengthening the physical infrastructure, makes a lot of sense.
If I may comment, I'm just back from Dubai. I had a meeting with the Minister of Climate and Water Resources, or don't remember exactly what was the name of the ministry, but what is that from the conversation with the minister, Ms. Maheri, she said the biggest risk is not to take a challenge. So here in the community development, the biggest risk, we do understand that this is really challenging, but the biggest risk is not to take that challenge. So we took the challenge, and so together with you, also today you mentioned some landscape partnerships that are available worldwide. And together with all our partners and friends, we do hope that we are always open for conversations, for brainstorming, for thinking, revising, whatever project we submit to the government. After a minute after, we start revising or preparing another draft for submitting to the government. And I think that flexibility and also this open-minded actions should be a core or a fundament for our actions. Thank you.
I know we're running out of time. We have about 5 more minutes left. And I should have asked this question in the beginning, but there's so many questions. The question, integrated landscape management, when we're saying that, Ms. Hojayan, you are started saying the intention of the land reform as kind of the way people are rallying around it is to improve productivity in farming, in agriculture. And that's not integrated landscape management, right? That's improving agriculture. So how would this land reform address questions of, watershed management, farming, pasture land management, forest management, all these interrelated biodiversity management, interrelated issues when you talk about landscapes? I think we would have to add elements of these to the discussion as we go forward. Maybe that's just a comment to get feedback on. So
yeah, actually very well noted those things, and I think that we just didn't have time to talk about all the ongoing projects initiated by the Ministry of Economy, and there are around 14 ongoing projects, state-supported projects, and there are many of them also that financed. If we are talking about pasture management, these projects that we implement currently in 109 communities in 8 regions of Armenia. This is one thing financed by the World Bank. This is actually a loan that the Armenian government took from the World Bank, and also we do this big project as well. So there are many things that we can put together and understand what element is missing in here, but want to reassure that this is not only a land reform in our agenda, but there are many more ongoing and also drafted projects for the integrated landscape management application.
And I forgot to add the issue of mining, land use. The use of land by mining, and very often just in the middle of agricultural land. I mean, this is obviously, this integrated approach is definitely something that should be in our focus, yeah. And okay, so Mr. Sayadian, are you with us, or you have to leave? Hovik, you're here, right? So, and
Yes.
any maybe just some concluding thoughts before we go ahead.
Actually, as a geographer, I'm very much in favor for landscape planning, and we actually succeeded to do such a piloting of landscape planning tool for Lake Savan Basin in 2008, and also we had following up discussion in the Ministry of Urban Development. The former Deputy Minister of Urban Development, Ms. Alaverdian, was very active in developing of landscape planning approach in spatial planning, and I am happy to listen that the representative mentioned on micro-regional spatial planning with elements of landscape planning. That is what actually I would like to say. I completely agree with Alan that we have to have these integrated elements of forests, of mining, land cover and land use categories in one place. And for that, we have powerful, actually technical tools also, like a GIS, and we have very good also remote sensing specialists. All this setup we have to put in one place, and what Mr. Hojan mentioned, that is actually encouraging about land agency. Actually, that is one step towards land information system, which could be as a solid scientific based fundament for integrated landscape management. So that is giving hope, and also that is encouraging me for scaling up of our small scale but still successful cases. Thank you.
The only thing is that other institutions or the ministries should also endorse our idea, which this is one year we have even drafted a law for a land agency, and this is finalized and ready to be submitted to the parliament. Everything is ready, the concept is ready, so we need also endorsement from other ministries, so which is a little bit missing from the cadastre side, but still finalizing the discussions. So we do hope that by the end of this year we will finally came to a unified conclusion. Thank you much.
Thank you. So, Mr. Sayadian, you jumped into the lap of technology and institutionalization, which is a good step forward. And Ms. Avedian, any kind of concluding thoughts you have about this and the role of your ministry in moving towards integrated landscape management, if you agree with that approach, of course.
Իհարկե համաձայն եմ բոլոր խոսնակների հետ եւ շատ կարեւորում եմ նաեւ այստեղ համագործակցությունը, միջկառավարական համագործակցությունը տարբեր գերատեսչությունների միջև, որովհետև քաղաքաշինությունը, որ ասենք մեր կոմիտեն զարգացնում է միկրոռեգիոնալ մակարդակի համակցված տարածական պլանավորման ծրագրերը, այն չի կարող հաշվի չառնել համայնքների զարգացման ծրագրերը, որ մենք ունենում ենք յուրաքանչյուր համայնք մշակում է իր 5-ամյա զարգացման ծրագիրը։ Բացի դրանից մարզերը նույնպես մշակում են իրենց ռազմավարական ծրագրերը։ Այս ամբողջը իրար հետ համախմբված է լինում, համատեղ քննարկվում է եւ տարածական պլանավորումը, նույնիսկ գենպլանները, որ մշակում են, այդ ամբողջը եւ կադաստրը գերատեսչությունները համատեղ են աշխատում ու էլ ավելի արդյունավետ պետք է աշխատենք, որովհետեւ շատ կարեւոր է, որ բոլոր ոլորտները եւ ջրօգտագործողների, եւ քաղաքաշինական, եւ գյուղատնտեսական, որպեսզի մենք կարողանանք ունենալ զարգացած տարածական պլանավորում իր ամբողջ տեսակետից։
Thank you very much. That's great. Mr. Khojayan, any concluding thoughts on your part?
Actually, I talked too much today, so nothing to add.
Okay, thank you. Sarah, do you want to bring it home, like in terms of you know, any final observations? And of course, we don't expect a treatise on the future of Armenia, but you know.
Certainly not, but I have to say that it was really exciting for me to be part of this conversation, because it sounds like Armenia really is at the cusp of a series of new directions in terms of how you are doing land management and linking land management to your broader goals of economic change and transformation. And I really appreciated Armand's comment about the biggest risk not to take the challenge, because I think that is, all of us are facing that right now with the world of climate change and economic relocation and the potential that we have that we didn't imagine that we had for transforming to more regenerative processes. And I just, would encourage you as you're going through to think a little bit about the comments that I had made at the very beginning of my talk about the mental model changes that are needed to do this transformation. We're not living in a world where each ministry is really responsible for particular pieces of land. They're responsible for making sure those priorities are reflected in any integrated plan. So I loved hearing about I'd love to hear more about the 14 other, Ministry of Economic Activities. But the question is, can they have an opportunity to engage in the design of that together? And then look at what their own, sort of institutional priorities are. And at the same time, that's the horizontal piece. And the other side is, can you really build those vertical lines of communication whereby the local communities and governments and the other stakeholders are really connected to the decision-making at the national level and vice versa. And I think if you move in those directions, and it sounds like you've got a great foundation to begin to do that kind of work, I really would look forward to learning, to following what you're doing. And I hope that we'll have an opportunity through the 1,000 Landscapes for 1 Billion People initiative, maybe in the next few years, to find out what would be useful for you from the tools and services that are coming from there. So much good luck to all of you.
Thank you very much. Claudia, do you want to add anything? Any thoughts, comments?
I would just ask Sarah to maybe expand 1 or 2 more sentences on the potential she sees for this initiative, this global joint initiative, 1,000 Landscapes for 1 Billion People. So given the experiences in the Armenian context, given what you heard today, why do you think would it make sense to join this global coalition? What would be the added value?
I think the added value is that there isn't anyone in the world that has the solutions to all of this. It is a transformational direction for most countries in the world to shift from a pattern of degradation globally. in every country to one where we're actually reestablishing thriving economies, thriving agricultures, thriving, social, inclusive social businesses. This is something we're all trying to learn together. And I think we're trying to set up the 1000 landscapes to make it really easy for people in Armenia to connect up with people in other parts of the world who might have relevant solutions or might be relevant actors for your work. I think that could be really valuable for different groups that are in Armenia. We'll probably have working groups and various things depending upon what people feel they need and what they want. I also think that we are pulling together sets of curriculum and materials that can be used for training, drawing from the best we see around the world and pulling those together and finding ways to share them, whether it's electronically, by remote technology, or through supporting networks in Armenia to be able to provide those capacity resources to others. We're also looking at this whole question about how do you finance this work, and the World Bank's also exploring, and some others you work with are exploring, FAO, how to think about the financing of this. But it really is not only about government grants. It's really about looking at the aspects of the economy and how all of them can be contributing. So I think we're all learning together, but I think there's an opportunity through 1000 landscapes to really tap the best expertise and share experiences and models that could potentially be useful in Armenia. And we're hoping that the remote sensing pieces we're doing, it was mentioned earlier that a lot of the communities really can't use these technologies, and 1000 landscapes is very specifically focused on it's mobile phone first technology. It's like, let's use things that people can really work with on the ground. So we're hoping that some of these might be useful for working with Armenia. We're still in the process of pulling everything together, but we'd love to have the collaboration with you all to learn from what you all have also been doing. So.
Great, thank you very much. Well, Ms. Avetian, Sarah, Mr. Khojoyan, Mr. Sayadian, thank you very much for taking the time and participating in this intensive discussion, and Sarah for the great presentation that opened up a lot of directions of thinking. And of course, the entire Gates team, Claudia, Maria, Gohar has been working very hard, Shahinian, and Rosanna Acopian and Siranush Arichunian have been working very, very hard to pull this conference together, but also to make Gates happen. So thanks everyone, and please join us tomorrow at 2 o'clock Yerevan time for 2 other very interesting presentations and discussions. One on the socio-ecological approach and how that can help us develop more useful, locally relevant interventions, and also how to use technological advances to get more public participation as we move forward. Thank you very much, everyone. Take care.
Good luck, everyone. It was wonderful to meet you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Look forward, Sarah, to seeing you in Armenia soon. Yeah.
I hope so. That would be wonderful.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks you.
Thank you.